How can anyone, whether they want to work in a language school or privately from their own laptop anywhere in the world, create a rewarding and impactful career teaching English as a second language, even if they are just starting out or have no teaching experience or ability? Hi, my name is Lynette Kim, and here on the TESOL Talk podcast, I aim to answer that very question.
One of the easiest things for new teachers in particular to do is to burn through lesson materials, to have enough that's level appropriate, published materials and additional things to do, and somehow burn through these too quickly and find that perhaps you're doing a 60 or a 90-minute lesson and all of a sudden you've used everything. It's just everything's gone fast. Every task has gone faster than expected. Something you thought would go for 15 minutes only went for 5. Wow, the students got through it quickly. And wonder, why did this happen and what on earth to do about it? And this is what we're talking about today. And it happens to everyone. And in the early days, I remember times when I'm like having to think on my feet and pivot and add additional stuff in off the top of my head to fill time because things have just run out quickly. And then I've sat down and self-assessed after the lesson. I thought, why did that happen? I've taught this lesson before and it didn't happen. Why in this instance? What's different? And a few things that I realized was that perhaps I was tighter, wasn't concentrating as much, obviously different students, and I didn't set things up properly. And this is what's so important, is to set up your lessons properly. And what do I mean by this? And it's not lesson planning. First of all, before you go into any lesson, you need to prepare. Number one, think about the lesson theme, whatever that might be. It might be hospitality. It might be, travel. It could be something to do with psychology. It could be something to do with business. There's always a lesson theme that the lessons are talking about. And you're going to have to think about different scenarios that you could use to extend. So if it's talking about travel, then you could have students talking about their travel experiences, or you could have talking about different types of travel or modes of travel or the future of travel. Compare the future and the past, or compare travel within different countries. You need to have this in the back of your mind, things that you can use that are meaningful discussion. You're not filling in here because these are all things that people talk about, and that's the goal of your ESL students. So don't think, oh, I'm just finding time wasters. No, you're not. Now, the next thing you need to do is find additional vocabulary. Now, by vocab, I don't just mean lexical resource in words. I mean idiomatic expressions, short idioms that can be used for lots of different scenarios. Collocations, these are really good as well, and ESL students need to work on these. They can only learn them by memorization. So the more you use them, and the more you use the same collocations in different lesson themes, the better for your students. So don't worry about reusing these. The same goes for phrasal verbs. Never ever think that you're overdoing it with phrasal verbs. These are really important, and you want to have your students practicing these as much as possible. Now, I'm not going to explain what these things are in this podcast, because it'll digress, but you can always just look those things up in the dictionary. Terminology, precise terminology. Now, the low levels, say from beginner through to pre-int, we don't use a lot of precise terminology, but we're certainly adding a bulk of vocab for students. But above that, from intermediate up, you want to get precise with your terminology. So you wouldn't just say, like for a healthy diet, you'd eat, good food, meat, potatoes, salad, whatever. You'd be saying a balanced diet, and then you'd be saying things like now I'm going to draw a blank. Food's rich in antioxidants and rich in vitamins and minerals and fiber, and you'd start talking about different types of fruits and vegetables that are specific. So you'd get into the terminology side of things. Once you, particularly from upper intermediate, you want to definitely be doing this, but you can start at the intermediate level because you're preparing them for the next level in your lessons always. So this is definitely something. Now, there's no point in saying, oh, but the course book has vocabulary. That's never enough. That's the basis. This is the foundation. You're being paid as a teacher to add the rest and embellish. Otherwise, why the hell are you there? Students could just read the course books and listen to the recording, the listening sections, and get the answers from the teacher's book. So you're there to flesh all this out. The next thing is prepare each task. Yes, you heard that right. So just say you've got 2 pages of a published course book that you're going to teach over 90 minutes. And on those 2 pages, you might have, say, 5 or 6 tasks. So you've got to think to yourself, how long has each of those tasks got to go for? Now, timing isn't the be all and end all though, because some tasks should go longer and some should be done faster. So keep that in mind. But look at each task and think to yourself, how am I going to present this? How am I going to introduce this task? Now, I'm not talking about, are you going to read it aloud to the students to tell them what to do or have a student read it to the rest of the class? No. I'm talking about setting it up to pique students' interests. How are you going to get them to look at that task, and however you're going to explain to them to do it, and how are you going to make it so that they think, oh, I want to know about this. So thinking about each particular task, whether that means that you have interesting questions that'll start the task off before you even read the task question to the students or the instructions, or whether or not you give them a life story, a short, brief life story of one of your experiences, or whether you do a quick true false scenario about, like, related to that task, what's happening in that task, whether it's people talking about their life or their past or their family, and this, because a lot of tasks will focus on that. Now, another thing when you're pre-preparing is think about games that you could add to the tasks that you're looking at. So students do a task, but is there a way to extend that task? Which task should you extend with a bit of maybe a vocab game, maybe a bit of hangman, maybe a little bit of Pictionary or back to the boards, whatever is going to be relevant, because adults still love to play games, and it's still great review of the vocab, the scenario, the theme, and activities. The next thing is, how are you going to have your students explain to you the concepts and the vocabulary? So how are you going to do this? You want to have this, think about which students you should call upon, which ones can handle it, depending on the levels, to have students stand up and do some explanation, or go through some of the vocab with the students. Maybe even with the vocab, you could have like little mini spelling tests. Occasionally I'll do that. Now, the next thing after that, think about additional material from online sources. So, are there websites that you can go to that would bring out a lot more rich discussion? Websites where they could practice. So if they're doing hospitality English, websites where they can go on and book. Maybe they're booking in a restaurant. Maybe they're ordering food online. All of these sorts of things, Uber Eats, it doesn't matter. But what are you going to bring in technology-wise? Don't rely on the course book to bring everything in. So do a quick run through. It doesn't take long. Few minutes, you find a couple of websites that you can pull up in front of the class. If you've got an interactive whiteboard or computers that can the whole class can view. Now, the next one, you need to prep some questions related to the theme of the lesson that will draw out students' life skills. So think about what kinds of questions you could ask students related to the lesson in its entirety and related to certain of the tasks. And jot some of these down because they're not always easy to come up with on the fly. If you're good at it, fine. But if you're not, always have stacks of questions. Remember, the bulk of communication is asking and answering questions, and open questions, not closed questions. Keep that in mind. Now, during the lesson, so we're looking at how not to burn through your lesson. So if you've prepped all of this stuff, there should be no way. In fact, you'll be lucky to get through all the tasks. You'll be pushing it at the end to get through them if you've prepared properly. And now during the lesson, you implement these things. So 1, you need to present well questions on the board or whatever it is that you're going to use to gain students' attention and engagement in the lesson topic and for each task. So make sure your board is done well. Make sure you have some questions up there. Make sure that there's something visual then. Whatever it is, or you've got a little story or a scenario, a controversial thing. I remember teaching adult students about one lesson was about going to the beach, and they were all, and we were in Surfers Paradise, which was kind of funny. And the students were a bit like, oh, we know the beach, we go surfing, because they were upper level class. But I knew, because, we talked about all this sort of stuff in the past. So what I did is I actually got all the facts about how many people drown and all of the, like the dangers of the beach, like shark attacks, and how many people die of shark attacks, how many people die of drownings, what a rip is and all this, and what the signs at the beach all mean, because they thought that was all beneath them, right? And then we started discussing that, and then I told them about someone I knew that had been attacked by a shark and survived, thank God. But, and then we all sort of got talking about, by the time we'd had that discussion and set that lesson theme up, the students were raring, they were well and truly into it. And they'd also started talking about other accidents that family and people and themselves had been in, scenarios that had put them into danger. Suddenly this lesson had become rich, valuable, meaningful discussion where they were using their listening and speaking skills really well. They were thinking quick in English. They weren't, monitoring or translating themselves. It was very natural communication. And this is the goal. And that's what you're there for. So keep this in mind. Now, the next thing is demonstrating and explaining these tasks. So you're pre-prepared. So you've got some stuff to use. Never just tell students, here's task 2, go do it. And I have seen teachers do that. And that's dreadful. And they're all sitting there looking at each other going, I could have done that. We could have just done this book together without a teacher. So there's no setting up in that. Now, the physical side of it for the students, with the low levels, obviously beginner and even elementary, you might be holding up the book, pointing to the pictures, pointing at information, or if you have an interactive whiteboard, you're pointing it to it with the pointer, whatever happens. But don't just leave it at that. You need to demonstrate physically. You need to put it on the board. You need to think about how you're going to break down those lesson instructions. And number 1, before you even do all of that, get students to take turns at reading the instructions and as best they can explain to the rest of the class. Remember, people learn best when they're teaching others. So get students even involved in the instructions or the explanations of the actual task itself. Now, you want to look at always drawing out discussion during tasks, after tasks, and eliciting from your students additional vocab, the idioms, and feedback, and have these on the board. And don't feel like you have to always be up there on the board with your back to the students writing. Have students come up and take turns at being a scribe and get the rest of the class to help them if they misspell something. You don't have to stand up the front the whole time. In fact, I hate doing that. I'm lazy. I would rather sit back and have students standing up at the board writing. So, yeah, look at how you're going to elicit all of that from the students. Have word banks on the board that they're adding into. Pull out every inch of richness from every task, every topic, possible vocabulary, possible discussion from each task. And then we're going to go on and also feedback from the students. We're going to go on and look at during the lesson games, adding in extra games. So you do a dialogue with students, and that's great, and they've practiced that. Have then pairs come up to the front of the board and act it out. So they've done dialogues in pairs, but then when they have to stand up in front of the rest of the class and act them out, have them add some humor to it and act it out. Have them play charades and act it out. Not every task, but certainly one task of each lesson you could do things like that with, and it just adds so much more fun. And then students actually get to play make believe that they are in those situations, like they are ordering in a restaurant, and these are the silly things that can go wrong, and have them sit up the front and then have a student be the waiter and take their order and all the rest of that stuff, because I know if I were learning a language and I wanted to feel confident to order in a restaurant, I would like to have acted out that scenario first. So don't rush through an activity where there's just a bit of a dialogue between, two fake people, and the students are doing those, and then one person has a waiter, or one-on-one waiter and one person, and that's all they ever get to do to practice. That doesn't feel real, and they'll walk out the class and forget, what did I say? Whereas if they'd acted it out, especially in front of the class, and taken turns at doing so, not knowing when they're going to get called, so there's that bit of suspense as well. Then when they do go outside in the real world and order in a restaurant, they're far better prepared. Another thing here is with the instructions, and I mentioned this before, have students read the instructions to the class. Now, you might have to put, for low levels, the instructions on the board. You might have to draw stick figures. You might have to break down task instructions into 2 or 3 parts. That's fine. But also call upon students to explain it to the rest of the class as best they can in their English. And if they're high-level students, then they should be doing this. They should be telling and explaining to the class and to you and giving their take on it, or this is a really good one too, ask students to read the task and put the task question in their own words, and in their own words tell the class what to do in order to complete that task. That's a really good one for the high-level students. And, all of these things are constantly adding to their use of language, their creativity. So they're not learning by rote. They're not trying to memorize everything, because it's a whole different type of learning system when you're learning another language.